Welcome to Louisa May Alcott is My Passion, the podcast.
I call you friend, though you lived long before me. It's your words, your wisdom shining through.
For all of you who are endlessly fascinated with the life and works of Louisa May Alcott, this is your podcast. Here we gather as scholars, teachers, students, and fans to learn from each other, talk with each other, and celebrate our passion for the Alcotts. We'll read from Louisa's works, share the latest news, discuss her work and life with fascinating guests, and sometimes even hear from the old girl herself. And now, on with the show. I am here with Lorraine Tosiello, who is the author of a brand new novel called Only Gossip Prospers, a novel of Louisa May Alcott in New York. Lorraine, I've been looking forward to this conversation and welcome, and I'm looking forward to what we're going to be talking about with this great book.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about it too.
I can imagine. Okay, so please, first of all, tell us about your background.
Well, I've been thinking about what I would say regarding my background because the bullet points on my resume kind of don't add up to becoming an author of a Louisa May Alcott novel at age 65. But the facts are that I basically grew up on Long Island, which is a bedroom community of New York City, which means you sleep on Long Island and you go into New York City every day. And I went into New York City for college. I went to NYU. Medical school, I went to what was called State University of New York at Downstate. Now it's called Brooklyn campus. It was in Brooklyn, New York. I trained at a New York City hospital in Greenwich Village called St. Vincent's. And then I worked at Bellevue, which is mentioned in the book, the famous Bellevue Hospital, one of the city hospitals. So I found that in my life, New York City was kind of an overwhelming presence and part of the big shapers of my life. But through my life, I've written technical novels, I've written technical articles, I wrote a short medical history. But perhaps what prepared me the most for becoming an author was just that I read all my life. I read and I read and I read. And I read fiction mostly. I love reading fiction. So I think just hearing stories and how stories can be told in so many different ways was what made me ready to put together a novel at this point in my life.
Cool. So you're a doctor with a burning interest in Louisa May Alcott. When did you first become interested in Louisa, and what sparked your interest?
You know, I read Little Women as the first novel that I ever read. I was 7 years old. I know I missed 99% of the nuance of that book, but I just loved Jo March from the day I met her. And I read that book over and over again as a young girl. And when I went on and started my medical career, raising my family and whatever, the reading basically stopped for most of my adult life. Then about 10 years ago, my family was grown, and I was able to start working part-time. And the first thing I wanted to do was to read again. And one of the first books I picked up was Little Women. And it all came rushing back to me. All the things that I had learned from Jo March. You know, the sense that a young woman or a woman of any age could accomplish anything, that she was always sort of fighting for the underdog and scoffing at convention. And I kind of saw all of my own basic traits and the values that had shaped my life. And it all came out of that little simple book for girls. So I think I've been interested in Little Women my whole life.
Interesting. And your history in terms of you read a lot when you were small, and then through your adult life you didn't, and then you took it up again. That's exactly what happened to me. I mean, I didn't read for years and years, and then about 10 years ago I started reading again, and it was like a whole new world. It really is wonderful when we can get back into reading and enjoy all kinds of different books.
And what we put aside when we're doing our chores, when we're doing what are the necessities of our life, our profession, and then raising our families, and we put aside that joy that we loved when we were young and that we're embracing again.
Mm-hmm. It's wonderful. It's a great thing. So Only Gossip Prospers is your first book. What drove you to write it? How long did it take to write? What made you choose historical fiction? And I'd love to hear all about the process.
So when I mentioned that back about 10 years, I reread Little Women, then I started to reread all of Alcott's work, Little Men, Old Fashioned Girl, et cetera, et cetera. About 4.5 years ago, I took a road trip with my sister. We went up to Concord and we visited Orchard House. And you know, Susan, what that's like
Yep.
when you go into Orchard House, how profoundly moving it is. I just think it's the most remarkable author's home that I have ever been in. And for anyone who's been there, many people feel the same, because when you walk into that house, you feel like you've entered it before, that you know it. You know that house before you go in the front door. So many parts of Little Women are there. And that's because Little Women itself it's biographical fiction. So a biographical historical fiction just seemed to be the essence of what I should do in order to describe Louisa. So I read her work, then I started reading all about her. So I read all those biographies, I read the letters, the journals, until one day a friend said to me, "You know so much about Louisa May Alcott, you should write a book." And I started thinking, and I started looking more into deeper research. I went to the libraries, I went to Houghton, I went to archives, and I read diaries, and you know how much the Alcotts have left behind
Oh, yes.
in the written word, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I read all of that. Then the story came to me. I was actually walking in New York City. I was in one of the older parks downtown. It's called Stuyvesant Park. And that was built, I'd say, 1830, 1840, and the buildings around it are still from that time. And as I stood there, I said, these buildings were here when Louisa was here.
Mm.
And like a bolt of lightning, I said, Louisa in New York. And so then I started reading about New York City history. And I really have the fortune of living right near the main research branch of the New York City Library, you know, the big one on
yes.
6th Avenue with the two lions.
Mm-hmm.
That's my local library, so I'm really blessed.
Yes.
So on my days off, I would go there and I would read the newspapers from 1875, the New York City newspapers. So I was sort of soaking in the language of the time and the descriptions of the city and, you know, the kinds of little stories that they would put in that were social interest stories. In the book, I even reproduced word for word a Lord & Taylor's fashion ad. It's in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And so that way I incorporated, all those sort of the feel of New York City. So really, I started with Louisa, went on to all of the biographies, went on to New York City. That research took about 1.5 years. The writing took about 1 year. The editing took about 1 year. And the process to make it a book, we've just finished. So it's really taken about 4 years, I would say. But it's been simmering a lifetime.
Oh, that's cool. What I love about the topic of your book is that that's a period in Louisa's life we don't hear so much about. And I remember when I read Madeline B. Stern's biography of Louisa, that particular period seemed to be a happy time for her. And you're so used to seeing Louisa burdened with her family problems and burdened, they were burdened with poverty, they were burdened with this, that, and the other thing. And to just see her go someplace and have a good time was like, yeah, Louisa knew how to have a good time. So I thought that was really cool that you delved into that period. Now, Only Gossip Prospers is full of twists, turns, and surprises, which I don't want to give away anything. Just suffice it to say, readers are going to end up shouting out loud while reading if they're anything like me. While avoiding spoilers, can you please sum up the plot and premise of your book?
Okay. Well, Louisa May Alcott really did travel to New York for the winter season of 1875. And as you said, she was at the height of her fame. She was a literary phenomenon. She couldn't really go to public events without being mobbed, really. And she actually did stay at a hygienic bath hotel where she took the bath cure for her rheumatism and her neuralgias. And from that presence, that sort of beginning, that premise, I was able to create around her stories of real people who she met, because we know who she met, and then to also add characters that seem sort of cut from the cloth of her own juvenile novels. So we have Casey, a newsboy who becomes her local guide. And at the Turkish bath, she meets Rebecca, who's a former slave, and she meets an aspiring author, and she meets a young professional actress. And I think anybody who is a reader of Alcott will already be able to make connections to some of her stories that have these very same characters in them. And meanwhile, New York is all around New York, Louisa, and the literary and the social and the theatrical life of New York really attracts her. And so the events of the city intertwine with real characters, with fictional characters. And I'll just say that she makes some very good friends. And she also faces a lot of disappointment in the actions of some of those that she meets.
Yes, good way to sum that up. Now, your portrayal of Louisa is the most fleshed out, comprehensive by far that I've seen. I mean, she's a very complex and often conflicted woman, and throughout the book, in typical Alcott transcendentalist fashion, you have Louisa examining herself, her motives, concerns, actions, and thoughts. Please describe further how you sought to portray Louisa and how you made use of this self-examination technique.
Well, Louisa, she really expunged a lot of her journals and her diaries. But even so, through her work and through her diaries and her journals, she left us a picture of a woman with a very distinctive voice. She was a private person. She protected her privacy, but she also sort of never could believe that the public adulation she encountered was justified. I always had that feeling that Louisa sort of felt like, oh, she really wasn't that great a writer.
Mm-hmm.
So I asked myself, what was she, like a staid Victorian children's storyteller? That's what Edna Cheney, her first biographer, wanted us to believe.
Right.
Or was she more that feisty advocate for women's rights? She got into authors' rights. She put those words in Joe March's mouth, in Joe's Boys. That was a personification of herself. Was she just a boisterous joker? You know, her neighbors in Concord liked to leave little stories about how jovial she was. And she was really all of those things. Like you say, she was really, really very complex.
Mm-hmm.
She was witty. She was self-deprecating. She was generous. And that's the person who I tried to portray in this book. I say again, for all of her big voice, I don't think she was really all that self-confident.
Mm-hmm.
And she always seemed to retreat back home when flattery and the fawning got overwhelming.
Right.
And in this book, because of that, I have her constantly wondering, when would the gig be up? When would the public realize that she really wasn't such an epitome of the successful Victorian woman writer that they had come to idolize?
Mm-hmm.
And also because Louisa has a few skeletons in her closet too, and they sort of come out in the course of the book. I'll just leave that little hint hanging there.
Oh, perfect tease. Oh, that's good. I've not seen Louisa portrayed in fiction all that often, and there's probably more examples than I'm aware of, but everything that I have read up to your book had kind of presented a kind of a one-dimensional character, possibly a little bit of a two-dimensional character, but it was always like the burdened older sister taking care of the family, and there wasn't that there wasn't that spark of generosity, there wasn't that wit, there wasn't that the things that I associate with Louisa too, particularly when she
Uh-huh.
was younger. I mean, that was what was so attractive about her, is that she's a bigger than life type person, such a force of energy. And that hasn't this is the first time, frankly, that I've seen that come out, which is one of the things that made your book such a delight, because I'm like, yay, finally a really fleshed out portrayal of Louisa. So congratulations on that one.
Oh, thank you so much. That really means a lot.
Oh, good. Now, you had described some of the real life characters that you put into the novel. You did a lot of wonderful settings in New York. It's like anybody who's interested in 19th century, late 19th century New York is going to love this book, because it's like you take us on a tour through all these different places. I recognized Murray Hill because I visited there. I remember the brownstones, and they were quite amazing. And I was just wondering what were some of the settings that you used in this book?
Yeah, just like so many. First of all, Louisa loved the theater, and she went to the theater so many times while she was in New York. So I have more than one evening that she spends in the New York City theaters. And she really did go to the Newsboys' Lodging, and she wrote a lovely note to her nephews, Anna's sons, about the Newsboys' Lodging. And she mentions in this letter how they lock up their coats and they put money into a special bank and they study in the evenings. And all of that I have included in the book.
Mm-hmm.
She really did go to the tombs. She really did go to Blackwell's Island to visit the orphans on Christmas Day. And a big part of why I wanted to write this book in the way that I wrote it was because the women that Louisa mentions in her journals and in her letters were really luminaries of the New York City literary and journalistic and social circles. But we don't know any of their names now. Mm-hmm. I read her journals and I said, who were these people who she hung out with? And then came to find that Mrs. Gibbons was an amazing social activist. She worked on women's prison reform and halfway houses and vocational rehab for prisoners. She was one of the most important lobbyists in Albany trying to get money for these kinds, government money for these kinds of interests. And yet nobody today knows that name of Abigail Hopper Gibbons, and she was one of the most important women in New York at the time. So while I was researching this book, the New York Preservation Society got involved with a home on 29th Street that, lo and behold, had been the house where Abigail Gibbons lived, and we mention it in the book about the New York draft riots that occurred, and her daughters had to flee from that home. Mm-hmm. And what was happening in New York City 2 years ago was that the current owners wanted to put an addition on the roof. Mm-hmm. And the New York Preservation Society said, no, you can't do that, because that's where those Gibbons girls escaped through the skylight.
Oh, yeah.
And I would never have even known this story if I hadn't been reading about Louisa May Alcott. And it's the same with the other outstanding women in her circle. So Sally Holly was an abolitionist. She really stayed at the Bath Hotel when Louisa was there, and they really did go to Central Park together. And Mrs. Boda, who ran the most famous literary salon, Louisa really did go to her homes in the evenings, and I have a lot of fictional things happening and a lot of revelations in Mrs. Boda's home. And then Jane Crowley and Mary Booth, they were two women editors. They were journalists, and they were syndicated columnists, and they would have been as recognizable to the public of that time as maybe like Anna Wintour is to us today.
Oh.
And we know nothing about them. So I set the scene at Cirrhosis, which Jane Crowley really did run that club. It's where Louisa tells the story about revolving for the girls at Vassar College.
Oh, right,
and that's one of the vignettes that people just always repeat about Louisa. Mm-hmm. So all of these things actually happened in New York in those kinds of settings that we mentioned.
Sounds like a very rich setting to the whole thing. I mean, there's just no wonder you were able to come up with all these different things that you came up with in the book. The book offers a tapestry of scenes and scenarios that would appeal to many interests, from New York City life in the latter 1800s to 19th century social justice and reform issues, to alternative medicine and fads of the time, to Alcott's many books and stories, and to delicious new tidbits of information for us Alcott aficionados. I suspect, too, that it reflects your many interests. How did you bring all of this stuff together into the story?
Oh, wow. Well, Susan, if you only knew how much wound up on the cutting room floor,
Oh,
so
I
to
have a
speak.
good idea.
So I really packed the first draft of this book with so many facts and historical explanations. So I'll give you an example. I have Louisa go to view the Brooklyn Bridge. I don't know that she really did that. But it was being built at the time, and it was something that was in the newspaper every single day. And so finally I read about the construction of that bridge. The bridge had always fascinated me. And I came to understand how the caissons worked, and the bell jars, and the pressurized oxygen, and underwater excavating. And in the first draft of the book, I had all that information in there. And then my editors got me to understand that I needed to pare it down to only what Louisa would have been interested in.
Right.
And you know what Louisa would have been interested in was that the wife of the engineer, Emily Warren Roebling, was the actual field engineer for the project.
Oh.
Her husband had been disabled by Caisson's disease, and she completed the project.
Oh.
And so that helped to illuminate one of the themes that runs through the book, because it really does have a strong feminist strain in this book. In terms of, my interests, I know that there's a lot of medical conditions and maladies in the book. It's consistent with the setting that's in a hygienic hotel.
Yes.
But I think that my medical background made it very easy for me to write about, characters with infirmities and know that it would ring somewhat true. And then also, I have some interests about people who are peripheral to the Alcott family. So that a real boy who lived with the Alcotts for some time, that's Llewellyn Willis, he circles into the story, and a member of their Fruitlands community, Isaac Hecker, he circles into the story because they had important lives after their Alcott connection, and it seems interesting to have them come back and meet Louisa. So it sort of is, like you said, a tapestry. It's a cross-section of people who lived in New York at that time, interests that Alcott had, and interests that I have, I guess.
Yes. I just thought, I love the way that you brought in those, as you call them, the peripheral people. I mean, it was I'd forgotten about Isaac Hecker. There's a wonderful scene with him in the book, and I thought that was great. How did you come up with the title?
Well, Louisa really did write a letter to her father from New York, where she said, and I quote, "I should love to have you here, but don't think conversations would prosper in New York. People are too busy to think, and only gossip prospers." So she was sort of warning him away from coming to New York to give his conversations, because she knew that he was just a little bit too ethereal for this sort of boisterous audacity of New York with the entrepreneurs and the hustle, the bustle. I think she was comparing the quiet, kind of reflective, philosophical person that her father was.
Yes.
And that he wouldn't be able to make it in New York because only gossip prospers.
Oh, very interesting. I do remember reading that in the book, that it was in that letter. I was just, thanks for that. That's a good explanation. Do you have plans to write more books? And if so, what do you have in mind?
Oh, well, that's a great question. So I have another book. It's more than half written. It's also based on Louisa May Alcott, and it's a very, very different work from this one. So I'll just say that it's a sort of a conversation in letters between Louisa and another famous woman author of her time. I will not reveal that author yet. I'm going to leave it at that for now. It's being written by myself. I do Louisa's voice and another writer who does the other woman author.
Oh, interesting. Oh, that
And
sounds very interesting.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful. It's whimsical. It's luminous. And it's really improbable. It's as improbable as most of the things that happen in Only Gossip Prospers.
Oh, good. Something to look forward to. That's awesome.
Yep.
So where can people find your book?
Okay. Well, you know what? I wanted to mention one other thought that I have
Yes.
about future books.
Uh-huh.
Because, Louisa, she traveled to Boston. She traveled to Paris. She traveled to London. There can be Louisa in a lot of places. But one that I know for certain I'm going to be writing after I finish the epistolary novel, it's going to be Louisa and May in Rome.
Oh, yeah.
So that for sure is going to be like a sequel to this one.
Oh, that should be a lot of fun.
Yeah, because really, second to New York, I feel very at home in Rome,
Mm-hmm.
and I was able to go on a walking tour there recently of some of the sites that are really integral to both May and the sculptors that she studied with and Louisa. So I have some thoughts about that one.
Awesome. That sounds great. So where can people now buy your current book, Only Gossip Prospers?
Okay, well, it's being sold online at Barnes & Nobles and Amazon and my publisher's site, which is Pink Umbrella Books. And I always sort of encourage people to buy from their local bookstores. Most stores will get any book that you request. And, I'd like for people to sort of support the small businesses, uplift their community, and rather than the big company that paid no federal taxes in 2018, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
So, Louisa, when she wrote Hospital Sketches, she chose a small publisher, partly because that publisher, Redpath, was going to donate some of the proceeds of her sale to widows and orphans of the Civil War. And I kind of like to think, that she would smile if she knew that, for example, people bought from Orchard House, because then Orchard House would make the proceeds, or a small community bookstore. That's what I kind of encourage. And you know what another good idea is?
Mm-hmm.
Tell your local library to get a copy.
Yes.
That way it's available for more readers.
Yes, I think that's an excellent idea. Do you have any speaking engagements coming up?
The book launch is December 10th, but I can't give out that information because it's really fully subscribed already.
Okay.
I am speaking at the Queens Public Library. They have a beautiful new branch in Hunters Point. It's a beautiful architecture and right on the East River. And that's January 30th at the Hunters Point Library for anyone who's in the New York area.
Mm-hmm. Great. And how can we keep up with you online?
Well, Susan, you have such a great presence online, and your site is so attractive, and I just don't know what to do with Facebook. I go weeks without looking at it. So probably the best way for anyone to contact me online is through Instagram, because I do Instagram almost every day.
Yes.
And my Instagram account it's my first initial, L, and then Tosiello, _author.
Oh, okay.
And if anybody wants to shoot me a message through Instagram, I can give you information as it comes up if I know of more speaking engagements. And if book clubs want to send me questions in advance, I could make contacts through Instagram. Okay?
Yep, wonderful. That sounds great. Well, congratulations on your first novel. I highly recommend it. I'm going to post my review on December 11th, and then a couple days later we'll post this podcast so that people can get to know you and I hope that they'll run right out and buy your book, because I'm telling you, I loved it, and it's a lot of fun, and I highly recommend it.
Thank you so much, Susan. It's really just so amazing to hear that coming from you. Really. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the advanced copy. All right, so we've been talking to Lorraine Tosiello, and I will be posting on the blog post her Instagram information so that you can reach out to her. And her book will be available on Barnes & Noble and Amazon and through Pink Umbrella Books. And yes, please go to your local libraries, go to your local bookstores and request it. And that would be great if they could show up in these bookstores. Lorraine, thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Susan. Good night.
Good night. My thanks to Lorraine Tosiello for the wonderful preview of her book, Gossip Only Prospers, a novel on Louisa May Alcott in New York. You can find Lorraine on Instagram and Facebook. I will include the links in the blog post. Visit the Pink Umbrella site at pinkumbrella.publishing.com and click on the news link to read more about Lorraine and her book. I posted a review on December 11th on my own website. Check that out. And when you visit louisamayalcottismypassion.com, be sure and hit the subscribe link if you haven't already so you won't miss anything. Until next time, happy reading.